Mr Ian Murray.
Thank you very much, Sir David. Can I start by paying tribute to the Right Honourable and Learned gentleman? He's one of the very few voices of sanity on that side of the House with regards to Brexit. And when the history books are written about this damaging period to the United Kingdom, his name will be right at the top as the person who tried his very hardest to save Britain from doing damage to itself when leaving the European Union. And that's what everyone, or the vast majority of members on this side of the House, have been trying to achieve with the amendments to this bill, and certainly the amendments that are down in the names of my honourable friends and right honourable friends this evening. And Sir David, could I pay tribute as well to the clerks of the House who've marshalled this bill incredibly well through the course of the last 8 days in committee. The emails that have been coming to many of us who submitted amendments have been detailed, they've been very helpful, and great tribute goes to them. They thoroughly deserve their Christmas break. But I rest assured we'll be back in January to work them just as hard at report stage and third reading. So a Merry Christmas and thank you to the staff and the clerk's office of this House. I'm slightly confused by the Minister's approach to New Clause 54 and New Clause 13, the two clauses that I would like to concentrate on this evening, particularly with regards to New Clause 54, because I thought the whole point of legislation in statute was to put government policy onto the statute book. I thought that government policy would come forward, whether it be in a manifesto, in a speech, as in the Florence speech, and then that would be codified in legislation in order that the government's wishes were put into law. That seems to me to be the process that this Parliament has been going through for several hundred years. And for the Minister to come to the dispatch box and say, yes, this is government policy, but we don't put it into law, seems to be an excuse not to put it into law. And I think we could all draw the conclusion from that excuse because, as the Right Honourable Gentleman for Rushcliffe has already indicated, the Cabinet don't agree on the Florence speech. They're trying to change the dynamics and the content of the Florence speech, and the Prime Minister is desperately trying to hold her extreme right wing of the Conservative Party into this process, and she's trying to manage her party rather than trying to manage this process. Otherwise, there was nothing, as the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman has said, in New Clause 54 that the Prime Minister didn't say in her Florence speech that shouldn't be codified in the bill to enable this Parliament and the country to be comfortable that that Florence speech is the direction of the government. I'm happy to.
And would you agree with me that it's no coincidence, given this reluctance to put into statute the Florence speech, that the Prime Minister appears to be rolling back today on Amendment 7, and we've heard the Minister doing the same from the dispatch box?
Yeah.
I'll come on to Amendment 7 because it's incredibly important, and that's why I was disappointed that the member for Vauxhall didn't take an intervention during her contribution to this debate, because what Amendment 7 did last week was show that this Parliament can speak. It gave power to this Parliament to say that we require a piece of legislation to go through the processes in this House to make sure that this Parliament has spoken when we leave the European Union. Now, the Minister, not unsurprisingly, but the Minister in his contribution sought to give assurances to many honourable and right honourable members in this House for the amendments they've put forward that the Government will do the right thing, but refused, absolutely refused, at the dispatch box on 3 separate occasions to give a commitment from the Government that they would abide by the will of this House and abide by that Amendment 7. In addition to that, the Prime Minister at the Liaison Committee this afternoon was asked on several occasions to abide by the Amendment 7 to this bill, and on all of those occasions she refused to give a cast-iron guarantee that the Government will not roll back on Amendment 7 in report stage. That is not taking back control, and I think the member for Vauxhall should reflect very clearly that if we do decide, whether you agree with the principles of Amendment 7 or bring a piece of legislation through this House to implement the deal, whether you agree with that or not, this Parliament has spoken, and therefore the Government has a legal, moral and democratic responsibility to abide by that decision and do what this Parliament has asked it to do. To do anything other than that will not just be kicking a hornet's nest, but in my view would be contemptuous to the honourable members who walked down the lobby last week to put Amendment 7 on the face of the bill. And I think if they do decide to roll back at report stage, it will show that the government's direction on this bill, and indeed on removing the UK from the European Union, is nothing to do with the future of this country, but it's to do with the future, indeed, of their own party. And the reason Amendment 7 is so important is because it allows this Parliament to have a say. And the reason this Parliament needs to have a say, and this comes to New Clause 54 and indeed New Clause 13, is because we can't trust a thing that ministers say. They are contradictory in all the aspirations that they wish to achieve through this process. And indeed Michel Barnier has said in the last 48 hours that the red lines that the government have drawn from themselves contradict the objectives that they wish to achieve from this process. And that's why we're bringing new clauses like New Clause 13 forward. I represent a constituency where tens of thousands of jobs, the entire Edinburgh economy, is reliant on financial services. And the head negotiator from the European Union said yesterday that the red lines that the government have drawn from themselves are completely contradictory to the aspirations to keep passporting and a unique deal for financial services. So tens of thousands of my constituents who rely on jobs or secondary jobs in terms of financial services look at these reports and say, well, if the government do wish to have the aspirations to keep the financial services passporting arrangements and to keep the financial services sector healthy in the UK, then they should put on the face of the bill that aspiration. And that's what New Clause 54 and the principle of it is seeking to do. If they don't do that, my constituents could draw the conclusion that they may have to throw some sectors under the bus. And the reason I say that is that nothing could be as good as the situation we have at the moment. We have free and unfettered access for goods and services. We have free and unfettered access in terms of the customs union. We have free and unfettered access, thank you, to the single market. And the aspirations of this government is to ensure that when we come out of this process, we have exactly the same, if not better, terms than we have at the moment. Well, that is completely and utterly impossible, because the European Union will never agree to the same benefits of the customs union and the single market if we're dealing with them on a separate negotiated basis. And that means, and it goes to the arguments that the member for Rushcliffe just made, that when doing individual bilateral trade deals with the US or Australia or India or wherever else, they will have to throw some sectors under the bus. And Michel Barnier has said in the last 48 hours that the red lines that the government have drawn and the aspirations they wish to receive for the financial services sector are contradictory and therefore cannot happen. So do we draw the conclusion that if the government refused to put any of these amendments on the face of the bill, that financial services is a sector that's willing to be thrown under the bus? If it's not financial services, and I can see the Minister shaking his head to indicate it might not be, maybe I could turn your attention to the Scotch whisky industry. Is it that sector, perhaps, that you'll determine to throw under the bus? Is it our wonderful Aberdeen Angus beef sector? Will we be flooded with antibiotic beef in this country in order to be able to get a deal with the US that may be contradictory to our deal with the EU? So if the Minister is saying no to all of these sectors, what sectors is it that he's going to throw under the bus? Because his government and his department have drawn red lines that the chief negotiator at the European Union says are contradictory to the aspiration of keeping financial services in the passporting arrangements with the European Union. I'm happy to give way.
The only red lines I've read recently from the Labour Party were the words of the member for Hayes and Harlington when he said we must leave the single market to respect the referendum result. And indeed the shadow spokesman on Brexit for Brent North, he said we must leave the customs union because it would be a disaster to stay in it. That's the only controversy I can see in your party tonight.
Nobody voted to leave the single market and the customs union, and as the Chancellor said, nobody voted in the European Union referendum to make themselves poorer. And if the Shadow Chancellor wants to walk down the lobby with the Conservatives in order to take us out of the customs union and the single market, then it's something I certainly don't agree with him on. And it's incumbent on me as an elected member who represents a constituency who voted 78% Remain and represents a constituency that's dependent on financial services, dependent on small businesses and dependent on the very healthy Scotch whisky industry, that I defend them in this House from a government who'd be quite happy to throw sectors under the bus in order to get any trade deal from any country anywhere in the world when we already have 57 free trade deals that benefit all of these particular sectors that I represent.
I don't know, I'm afraid of giving way. I'm not quite sure if he wants to say his constituents are dependent on Scotch whisky, but take his point. At the EFRA Select Committee this morning, the Environment Secretary, I asked him about the Canada +++ model, and he said that he wanted agri-food to be part of the plus deal, and he referred to the trade agreement with Japan as something that covered agri-foods. But isn't it the case that, as Michelle Barnier says, that we will simply not be allowed to cherry-pick and be able to insist that we have a Canada deal, but with something like agri-foods put in there?
Well, that's exactly what Michelle Barnier said. The Secretary of State for leaving the European Union wants a Canada +++ deal with a special arrangement for banks, and the chief negotiator said that is impossible for two reasons. One, it's against the red lines that the government have already drawn for themselves, so they're arguing against their own particular policy in terms of Canada +++. And indeed, we already have special arrangements in place for free and unfettered access to all of our sectors. It's called the Single Market and the Customs Union. And I made this point a few weeks ago when we were debating some of the issues in this very chamber on other days, that whether you agree with the Single Market and the Customs Union or not is essentially to this bill irrelevant. It should be in the negotiating position of the government to, at the very least, keep these on the table, to be able to look at them to say whether or not that's the way forward. Now, if we have the customs union and the single market for the transition period, why would we have that? Well, we would have that to allow businesses the certainty and security and stability they require to be able to make the changes they need. So when we come out of that transition period, which won't be 2 years now, according to Michelle Barnier, maybe a lot shorter than 2 years, we'll have to have a system that is no doubt worse than the transition period. So I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising the issue about Canada +++, because Canada +++ is impossible with the red lines that have been drawn. So perhaps the Minister could come to the dispatch box, he could intervene in me if he likes, or if he wants to intervene in any other honourable members, and tell us which red lines is his government willing to drop to achieve the government's aspirations of Canada +++ with a special deal for financial services. I have to give this.
Just as my honourable friend took evidence this morning from the Environment Secretary, the Health Committee took evidence yesterday from the pharmaceutical industry, who were completely realistic about the fact the government is not going to get any special sectoral deals. There won't be any cherry-picking, and they unanimously made clear to us that the only solution for us, certainly for the transition, is staying in the customs union and in the single market, and possibly also, hopefully, beyond that too.
And that's the key, because we've debated now. It may be 64 hours of debate in committee in this House by the time we get to vote at 10 minutes past 9 this evening. And it seems to me, if you distill all of the debates we've had in the last 64 hours, you get to the conclusion that we should stay in the single market and the customs union. And I can't understand why the government's decided to throw that entire strategy out the window, probably for ideological reasons.
I'm very grateful to my friend. Isn't the reality that all this talk of Canada or Canada +++ is an illusion, and it would be far better to go for the far better deal, which is Norway plus, and that we should actually stay in the single market because that is best for our economy and for our political influence in Europe.
But of course it comes to the crux of the government ideology, and no one can ever stand up on the government benches again and confidently pronounce that the Conservative Party is pro-business, because their strategy and the red lines they are drawing with regards to this bill is destroying business, is anti-business, and every single sector that either goes to the Health Committee or the Bays Committee or the Foreign Affairs Committee or the International Trade Committee, on and on and on, tell us that the only way to resolve these problems is the single market and the customs union. And if sectors are telling us that, the people who create the jobs, employ the people, create the wealth in this country, we should perhaps listen to them rather than listen to the extreme right wing of the Conservative Party, who claim to be free traders but want to throw out 57 trade deals for some aspirational trade deals that no one can tell us yet if there's anyone even in the queue or wanting to speak to us. That's surely anti-trade and anti-business and destroying the fabric and the economy of this country. I have to give way for the last time.
I thank him for giving way. Is there not a deep misunderstanding on the side of people who say we want free trade agreements but outside of a customs union, that actually creating a customs border is independent from how much tariffs we actually raise? There will still be a border, there will still be checks, because however freely or not freely we trade, if we create a customs border, it creates delays, it creates checks, it creates regulations, and so on and so forth. And people who are telling me, well, we're having a free trade deal, we will still have a border, and that is what a damaging thing is going to be.
And I'll finish on this point, Sir David, because that gets to the crux of new clause 13, because you have to have a border. And I'll keep making the same argument in this House, that the Minister and the Minister's colleagues in this House stood on the same platform as me during the Scottish independence referendum and consistently said that if the UK is split up and Scotland comes out of the UK single market, there would have to be a border at Berwick. Why? Because there'd be different customs arrangements. There'd be different regulatory arrangements. There'd be different free movement of people arrangements. There'd be different goods arrangements. So why now can the government stand there at the dispatch box with a straight face and say none of this will now apply to either Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland or indeed Gibraltar? There is no answer to that question because, again, the government's red lines and the government's narrative do not fit with where they want to go in terms of the final negotiations in this place. You cannot have frictionless free trade while having differential arrangements in terms of customs or regulatory alignment. It just doesn't work. And if the Minister again wants to intervene on me and tell me how it works, rather than just using narrative and rhetoric, I'm very happy to agree with him if anybody can understand if it will actually work. Happy to give way for the last time.
I'm very grateful for giving way. Isn't it interesting that when the public were consulted by the University of Central London, when they did a People's Assembly, with a representative body of the public from Leave and Remain, they came to the conclusion that they wanted to remain in the single market but extend all of the freedoms that we already have to limit freedom of movement. Yeah. That was the solution the public came to. Doesn't he think and agree with me that what we need to do going forward is listen more to the public and involve them more going forward?
I absolutely agree. And of the 34 million people that voted in the EU referendum, there was probably 34 million different reasons for why people voted one way or the other. But it's incumbent on politicians to start taking a lead, to be brave about making the arguments, to say to the country, yes, the EU referendum delivered the result, and yes, we will be leaving the European Union, but let's just pause and let's just look at the arguments that are being put to the country, and let's just say whether or not this is what people actually want. And we distill all of that down, all of the arguments about the customs union, all of the arguments about the single market. The only conclusion you can come to that doesn't damage this country in any way, whether it be jobs, whether it be cost to business, whether it be future aspirations for students and for our children, is to stay in the best possible platform for free trade and for regulatory alignment, and that is the single market and the customs union. And no one will forgive this government or anybody who argues against that when the first person leaves a financial services company in my constituency with the P45 in their hand. I will take no pleasure in saying I told you so, but the government can pull back now, can sort out this bill, can agree to some of these amendments in principle and come back at report stage and put on the table, at the very least, a negotiation about keeping the UK in the single market and the customs union. To do anything less, with the red lines that they've drawn and the aspirations that they have, is pulling the wool over the eyes of the public, and they should just be brave enough to admit it.